Thank you. You may recognize my title from various internet thread comments, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about fear and how it relates to spiders. If you see over here, there's a little table. I brought some of my friends with me. That's me. If you look really closely, there's one of my friends there. So anybody who knows me, you can just shout this out. What's my favorite animal? Tarantulas and spiders. So why are they my favorite animal? Is it because I'm a sadist? No, it is not. Is it because I enjoy provoking people on the internet? Also no. It's because spiders need the PR. I've worked with a lot of different types of animals. I've worked with apes and monkeys, reptiles, parrots. I've worked with fish and other aquatic animals. And whenever I talk about those animals, people are like, oh, monkeys. And when I talk about spiders, they're like, mm-hmm. And that's really interesting to me because my background is in comparative psychology. And that's how the brain works in humans and animals. We call them non-human animals because humans are animals, and we like to forget that. But the interaction between humans and arthropods is by far the most interesting interaction between humans and any other animals. And that's why I'm so fascinated with them. Everybody agrees that tigers need to be protected. Everybody agrees that whales need to be protected. But when it comes to really crucial animals and ecosystems like spiders, people get a little fidgety, and so they need a little hand with things. So here's some more of my friends. These are all arachnids. They're not all spiders. These are all my photos. Some of these critters you can see on the table over here. All right, so we're going to talk about fear and what happens in your brain when you're afraid of things. So we're going to talk about how and where fear lives in the brain because it actually has a place where it's kind of stationed in your brain. We're going to talk about the structure of the brain and the parts of it and how they work. We're going to talk about how you can control fear because you can control fear. And we're going to talk about how this goes way beyond spiders. I'm using spiders as an example here tonight, but this applies to a lot of other things. So this is the brain. This is your brain on animation. So we have some really cool technology called MRI and fMRI. And an MRI it stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And this is a way that people who study the brain can actually look at your brain. So your brain uses chemical and electrical impulses to transfer information inside. And it takes all of the sensory information from the world around you and it processes it inside different lobes. And an MRI can look at whether those electrical impulses are happening, and it can actually take a picture of them. And an fMRI takes it a step further. That's functional magnetic resonance imaging. And if an MRI is like a photograph, an fMRI is like a movie. So we can actually see the paths inside the brain. I got really excited when I saw Kendall's neurons in her slides because that's kind of like my background. So you have billions upon billions of neurons and glial cells inside your brain. And they're firing all the time. And we put people in MRIs and fMRI machines, and then we can actually look at what parts of their brains are being stimulated when they're doing different things. So we can show them pictures, have people do different tasks, we can have people interact with each other, and we can see what parts of the brain are being stimulated. So if you look over here, this back part of the brain, this is where visual stimulation goes. So when you actually see something, that stimulation is processed in the back part of the brain there, and that's called the occipital lobe. This top part that flashes green, that's called the parietal lobe, and that controls touch and movement. People that sustain injuries there often have problems with balance. We have the temporal lobe here that's flashing in blue. That's where the hearing is processed and auditory stimulation is processed there. So you might notice if somebody is hard of hearing or deaf and they have a cochlear implant, that implant that goes just above and behind the ear is actually stimulating that part of the brain. It's just bypassing what might be a faulty connection inside their ear. And then this in the front right here, this is a really interesting part of the brain. This is called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where logic lives. It's where reason lives when we are confronted with philosophical arguments. The intellect is really stimulated. That's the part of the brain that really controls that. And this is a part of the brain that we don't share with a lot of other animals. We only share it with what we call the other higher animals, like whales, great apes, things like that have something resembling a prefrontal cortex. And this is where a lot of This is what we would say civilizes us, even though it's a squishy scientific term. So that's a really important part of the brain to remember. So now this is the amygdala. And we're going to talk about this little guy a lot. So the amygdala is a very tiny, very ancient part of the brain. And we share the amygdala with a lot of other animals. Even really little mammal things that scurry around in the forest, they have an amygdala in their brain. And the amygdala controls fear and emotional processing. So when you get scared, the amygdala lights up, and it has a really interesting power over you, and we're going to talk about that. So this is the logic brain. This is a term I have coined for this presentation. So the logic brain is constantly moving all the time. There's electrical impulses shooting across it all the time. It's like a constellation of activity. That old chestnut about using like 10% of your brain, it's totally bunk. It's not true at all. We're constantly using all parts of our brain, and these electrochemical impulses are shooting all over the place all the time. So we're using that occipital lobe that takes the visual stimulus from around us, and things are getting sent over to our emotional processing part of our brain. The part of our brain that processes smell will take in a smell, and then the part of our brain that processes emotions will recognize that it smells like baking cookies, and it'll remind us of our grandma. So all of these lobes of the brain work together as you go about your day-to-day life. And this is where we come to the amygdala hijack. So when the amygdala is stimulated, it reaches a tipping point. So when people who are arachnophobes, raise your hand if you're an arachnophobe. Okay, a couple of hands. Okay, so when your brain recognizes a fear stimulus, the amygdala lights up and it starts to build, and the activity there will actually increase as you're confronted with a fear stimulus. And this can be a lot of different things, but we're going to talk about spiders because that's a pretty universal fear stimulus. And so this amygdala, when it lights up, what it actually does is it takes over your brain. It jumps into the driver's seat. And that front of your brain that we talked about that controls logic, that shuts down completely. So this thing jumps into the driver's seat, and you can no longer make an informed decision. People might get tunnel vision because the visual processing part of your brain kind of like goes offline. People talk about being scared out of their minds, and that's when the amygdala has hijacked the brain. When you trip over your words, when you're nervous because you're in a bar full of people talking about something you haven't discussed since college, the amygdala will start to light up and you can trip over your words because it's actually taking over, and the part of your brain that uses language and helps process those things will actually lose activity and start to flicker off. And so that's why we trip over our words when we're nervous. That's why we say things that we don't mean to say, or maybe like maybe you blurt out things that you don't mean to say when you're nervous. That's because the amygdala is taking over your brain. And this is a conditioned effect. This is something that can happen because you have a fear because either you have learned it from other people, fear is socialized. People often share fears with their parents, or because of a trauma. If something traumatizes you, like as a kid, you can develop a fear of that. And this is really widespread. If you do a quick Google, here's some screenshots here. Driver totals car when spider drops from rearview mirror. This lady rolled her car over multiple times. Luckily, she wasn't hurt. No word on what happened to the spider. This man sets home on fire after using blowtorch to kill spiders. There's dozens of these. People are losing their minds over tiny, almost universally harmless animals because of this amygdala hijack. So this is a real thing, and it makes it really difficult for me online when I see people like, kill it with fire. I'm like, don't set things on fire. This is not a good idea. Like, you guys need to get a hold of yourselves. So how do we get a hold of this? How do we get this under control? Because fear really can be like a steaming freight train when it gets out of control. And this can be a lot of different things. It doesn't just have to be spiders. So how do we control fear? So people who have anxiety might be familiar with this. People who suffer from panic attacks might be familiar with grounding techniques. So they say, find something around you that you can touch, and touch it. Find something around you that you can see and name it. Find something around you can hear. It's a way of becoming more in tune with the world around you. And what this is actually doing is, through effort, it's engaging the other lobes of your brain. And so think about those bikes, like you can ride those bikes that power a light bulb through effort. That's what you're doing. Through effort, you are physically re-engaging those other lobes of your brain so that amygdala doesn't have a chance to hijack them. You're recommitting those electrical impulses to other parts of your brain. So there's a formal way to do this, and it's called exposure therapy. Now, I am not a doctor. I am not a therapist. But I have had the privilege and the pleasure and the opportunity to sit in on exposure therapy, mostly because I am a weirdo who has a large collection of spiders. And I've had therapists call me and just ask if they can borrow some spiders for this therapy. But as a result, I've been able to actually watch this in action, and it's really amazing. So there's a couple of specific rules that go along with exposure therapy. So we measure fear, like in science. Science is basically the way to measure the world around us. So we have to measure fear. So a therapist might say, give you a scale of 1 to 5, and 1 being totally in control, unafraid, and 5 being scared out of your mind. And throughout this process, you want to stay very low. You want to stay at like a 1 or a 2 throughout this process. This is really important because if you get up into that 4 or 5 range, where the amygdala is hijacking the brain, you're just reinforcing that fear reaction. So we want to measure it, and we want to keep everything low. And it's very gradual. So if you're afraid of spiders, one of the worst things you could do is just come to my office and pick up a tarantula. It's going to be bad for you. It's going to be bad for the tarantula. It's a bad idea. So what you do when you start out is you might first just visualize in your mind's eye a spider. And so for some people, that might not be a big deal, but for some people, that might send them straight up to a 5. And so in that case, they have to back up, use those grounding techniques, re-engage those other lobes of the brain, and then they can keep that amygdala from taking over and control that fear response. And then once that's low, maybe they can move on to the next step, which could be maybe drawing a picture of a spider and see how that works. And if that sounds stupid, that's great, because if something sounds stupid to you, it means it's not scary. So that means that you can level up to the next thing. And you always lower your fear reaction to the previous stimulus before you move up to the next stimulus. So actually being confronted with a real spider, that's like the goalpost at the end of the field. You want to work your way there. And the biggest part of this is that you always want to be very kind to yourself. Don't tell yourself you're stupid. Don't make fun of people when they're scared of stuff, because it doesn't help anything. You can't force somebody out of a fear. The subject should always be in control. So in my work, it's a very informal setting. I'm not doing therapy with people, but I am exposing people to something that they tend to be afraid of. So usually what happens is I'm sitting at a little table, and then much like this, I have little boxes, and I have little creatures in all my boxes, and then people are coming up to me. And what I'm doing is very informal, but I still follow those rules from exposure therapy. So I don't have time to ask them to make a scale of their fears, but I do check them and I do kind of read them. I've learned to read people really well. I think part of that is innate, but part of that is just from experience. I've been doing this for 7 years, so I've seen thousands and thousands of people, and I've seen the entire gamut of reactions. So when they come up, I always am very welcoming. I start talking to them and I engage them immediately. And I usually can tell with what I believe to be some accuracy how afraid they are. You can read people pretty easily when it comes to this stuff. If they're closed in on themselves and not making direct eye contact and kind of grimacing, you know they're up at like a 4 or a 5. So I always watch and I keep talking to them. So I'm engaging them. How do you feel? What do you think about this? How do you feel about, have you ever seen a tarantula? I don't put the tarantula in their hand when they first walk up to the table. And often when people hear what I do, sometimes they recoil a little bit, like a tarantula is going to like pop out of my pocket at them. But I just keep talking to them, and I try not to take that personally. And I understand that I'm dealing with something that they're really afraid of. And I want to be very welcoming to them, and I'm very non-judgmental. I've seen people scream. I've seen people cry. It doesn't happen very often, but it is always an adult when that happens. It's always an adult. Little kids are a lot more open to this than adults are. But We do, so I do in an informal way, I kind of do this same thing where I can expose people. So I'm engaging those linguistic parts of their brain. I'm talking to them. And I might be saying things like, oh, the emperor scorpion lives in Central Africa and it lives underneath old logs in forest areas, and giving these kind of facts. But really what I'm doing is I'm engaging that person. And so they have something else to focus on so that that amygdala doesn't just take over. And the biggest thing is, remember, the subject is always in control. You never force people that are afraid of something to encounter that fear. It doesn't help anything. And I see this all the time. Almost every time I go out with my bugs, it's always a parent and a kid. And they come up and the parent will take the kid's already really scared, and they push him up to the table and they take their little hand and they push it towards a bug and they're like, touch it, it's fine. And the kid's terrified. And that's not how you beat a fear. The fact that they even came up to the table at all is a really big step. So just applaud them for that. But every time that happens, I think about this. I'm going to play this clip for you from an old movie, and I think about this all the time. Oh, is it not playing? 49.
Why not?
I can't swim.
You can't what?
I can't swim.
How old are you?
6.
So I'm pretty sure that's not how that kid learned to swim. So you cannot force people out of a fear. If you have friends that are afraid of something, please don't play pranks on them. Oh, this is really important. If people are already afraid of something and you try to force them into something, or if you want to take that opportunity to play a prank on them, it doesn't help them. It just reinforces that fear reaction, because now the brain knows that it has to be on watch even more. And so that amygdala is going to light up even more, not only in front of that stimulus, but in front of you. And it's going to give that person a really good reason not to trust you. So be kind to people when they're afraid of things. And if you're afraid of something, be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up over it. So this actually can go over to a lot of other parts of your life. So public speaking can be very terrifying, getting up in front of 100 people and talking about the brain when you're not a brain specialist. But if you repeatedly do this over and over, that amygdala reaction will be softened every single time. And remember, we talked about that linguistic part of the brain being overpowered by the amygdala when you're afraid. So it makes you trip over your words. So it makes you more nervous. So you start messing up and you get more nervous and the amygdala lights up more. So it's kind of a feedback loop. So you got to start small. Start by just imagining a group of people in front of you and start giving a talk. And if that sounds stupid, that's great, because that means you're already past that stimulus level. But you got to start small. If you're a person who's afraid of conflict and standing up for yourself, the amygdala controls emotional reactions. So if you're a person who bursts into tears at the sight of conflict, that's a real thing. That happens a lot. You got to start small. If your coffee comes back wrong at Starbucks, politely ask to send it back. That's a really good place to start out. And then you can work your way up to that awkward conversation with your roommate without bursting into tears. But you have to be kind to yourself, and you have to start small and work your way there. Remember, the goalpost is at the end of the field, and you just got to get there. Trauma. You can recover from trauma slowly and methodically. If you're in a car accident and it makes you afraid to drive your car, you could just barrel onto the highway in a cold sweat and get to work every day. Or you can Uber to work for a couple days, get your feet back on the ground, go out in front of your house and sit in your car. And just sit there and get yourself back down to a 1. Use those grounding techniques. Start small, start slow, and be kind to yourself. So go slow, be brave, be kind to yourself and others, and seek help. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope you'll take away hope, because science has shown us that there is a method available to us. And if you're willing to put in the work, you can learn to control your fears so that your fears don't control you. Thank you.